Yeah, everybody, you can hear me now? Okay, great. All right, so good morning, everybody. I think we'll make a start. So, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, I'd like to welcome you all to the event on policy coherence and synergies in action in small island developing states here at COP29. My name is Tishka Francis, and I'm the head of the Small Island Developing States subprogram at the United Nations Office of the High Representative for LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS, OHR-LLS, and it is indeed a pleasure to convene this event with UNDRR. And my task today is to MC the opening session of this event. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our opening speakers. First, we will hear a video message from Ms. Rabab Fatima, Undersecretary General, United Nations Office of the High Representative, OHR-LLS. And now we will hear from the USG and High Representative.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I thank the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction for co-organizing this important event with us. I'm so very pleased to address you today on a critical issue for the small island developing states, that is, for strengthening policy coherence and synergies towards more effective climate action and disaster risk reduction. As climate change intensifies, increasing the frequency, magnitude, and duration of climate-related hazards, SIDS find themselves on the front lines of this crisis. Climate change is a major driver of disaster losses and SIDS, severely hindering the sustainable development. The escalating frequency and intensity of climate-related disasters exacerbates existing social, economic, and environmental vulnerabilities for these countries. According to UNDRR reports, SIDS comprise up to 2/3 of the countries facing the highest annual disaster losses globally. Their small size, remoteness, and heavy dependence on global markets make them especially susceptible to external shocks, with any significant disruption posing a risk to their entire economies. To build resilience, SIDS require a comprehensive, systematic approach to assessing and managing climate risks. Integrating disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation perspectives and approaches is essential, as is aligning these efforts with other sustainable development frameworks. Global agreements like the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and now the Antigua and Barbuda Agenda for SIDS, the ABAS, all underscore the need for concerted action on climate and disaster resilience. The ABAS calls for enhanced international support for the SIDS to address adaptation needs, minimize and address loss and damage, and enhance capacity and resilience in the SIDS. Achieving these goals demand collective global action and necessary investments. My office is committed to supporting SIDS in these efforts. We are working with the entire UN system and various stakeholders to develop a monitoring and evaluation framework for the ABAS, ensuring alignment of implementation with the other global frameworks, including the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework, and the SDGs. Complementing this, we are developing a toolkit to support ABAS implementation at the national level in coherence with efforts at regional and global levels. We are engaging our SIDS national focal points extensively in this process, with special attention to the unique needs of the A's SIDS, given their unique coordination challenges. Finally, Excellencies, we are fostering partnerships with relevant stakeholders, including civil society organizations and the private sector, to mobilize further resources and generate innovative solutions for climate resilience and DRR in SIDS. In closing, I extend my heartfelt thanks to our speakers and participants for participating in this side event and for their valuable contributions to the discussions. We look forward to today's discussions and the insights that this will provide towards advancing coherent policy implementation for the SIDS. I thank you.
I would like to thank the USG and High Representative for her statement. I now invite to the state podium Mr. Kamal Kishore, Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and head of UNDRR, to address the meeting.
A very good morning to everyone, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, dear colleagues and friends. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this event. I'm very thankful to USG Rabab Fatima and her team for co-organizing this event with us. As I started my job in the very first week, I went to Antigua and Barbuda to attend SIDS 4 conference. So personally, a follow-up discussion on that conference is very important and significant for me. At the conference in Antigua and Barbuda, the Antigua-Barbuda agenda for SIDS was adopted, and we were quite delighted to note that it had significant emphasis on building climate and disaster resilience. In response to Abbas, UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction issued its offer of support to implement Abbas from a disaster risk reduction and resilience perspective. It makes eminent sense to do it because more than any other group of countries in the world, disaster risk is a huge issue for SIDS. If you look at data from the Sendai Monitor is a system that captures losses and damages from disasters against and measures progress against the Sendai targets. If you look at the data from Sendai Monitor, you see that the mortality rate in SIDS is twice that of rest of the world. And I don't have to talk to you about the economic impact. Economic impact on SIDS from single events sometimes is a huge proportion of their GDP in a single event itself. So it's really important. It's an important area of work. Disaster risk reduction for SIDS is not an additional issue. It's not an issue of making some incremental progress, but it is a central development issue for SIDS. So now, in order for us to effectively implement the Abbas, the Antigua and Barbuda agenda for SIDS, from a disaster risk reduction perspective, I would like to propose 3 very specific steps. I think the first is to have a really quantitative understanding of what is the risk and how the risk is progressing. And towards that end, we need to understand the observed and projected impacts of disasters and climate change to inform national level disaster risk management plans and actions. Many of the SIDS are already doing that. Yesterday in the high level panel on early warning system, for example, we heard from Tonga, we heard from Maldives, how they are integrating disaster risk reduction in their national development plans. And from UNDRR perspective, I talked about Sendai Monitor. We have established a disaster loss tracking system in over 100 countries, of which more than 30 are small island developing states. We are now working very closely with our UN system partners, UNDP and WMO, to develop a new generation loss and damage tracking system, which will further improve our understanding of risks in these countries. In addition to that, we have to not just look at what is the realized risk in terms of actual disaster losses, but also what is the projected risk, what is the projected losses. So towards that end, we are trying to reinforce our capacities, our collective capacities for risk modeling and assessments as well. So that's the first point, comprehensive work on understanding the risk, both in the form of systematizing the losses that are already occurring, but also having capabilities for futuristic risk assessments. The second is we have to create a coherent policy basis for implementation. It's really important that the work on climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction is brought together and we have an integrated, comprehensive risk management framework. In this regard, I have to say that small island developing states can actually teach the world more than they have to learn from the world, because this discussion on bringing the work together on climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction is at least 3 decades old in SIDS. The rest of the world is only catching up on that. So it would make sense that where we have, we've yet to develop national adaptation plans, we see how we can build on the work that has already been done through the development of disaster risk reduction plans. For those of you who do not know the details of the Sendai framework, one of the 7 targets in Sendai framework is development of plans and strategies for disaster risk reduction at the national, subnational and local level. And that's one of the targets where we are doing the best. So many countries that do not have an adaptation plan have a disaster risk reduction plan, and 90% of disasters are related to weather and climate. So you have the foundations of what could be developed into a more comprehensive national adaptation plan. So I think that sort of comprehensive risk management approach, bringing together disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, and really making sure that it's enshrined in the national policy and legislative frameworks is really key. The third point is that we have to evolve, strengthen the financial frameworks. Existing resources for meeting all adaptation needs remain hugely inadequate. Developing countries have made it known that the climate finance architecture, including development finance, has to be reformed to bridge the adaptation funding gap. Enacting these reforms is not charity, but a responsibility. At UNDRR, we've worked with financial actors to create this comprehensive approach to mobilize business investment in climate adaptation. Recently, we launched with private sector partners a guide for adaptation and resilience finance. This guide sets for the first time a common reference with over 100 investable activities to enhance adaptation and resilience, while also identifying additional co-benefits. So this kind of coherence will offer us the chance to simplify an increasingly complex multilateral architecture where agendas overlap, and this will help us focus on common goals that create impact on the ground. We have several important opportunities before us. We have been talking about early warnings for all. In the early warnings for all, the first set of 30 countries, 12 of them are small island developing states. So that clearly shows where our emphasis is. The second is, of course, the opportunity offered to us through the Santiago network, which is a great opportunity to enhance the quantity as well as quality of technical assistance to small island developing states to address loss and damage. UNDRR and UNOPS co-host the Secretariat, and the first request for technical assistance has emanated from Vanuatu, and we hope to really do a great job of it so that it sets the right tone for the functioning of Santiago framework. With that, thank you very much from the UNDRR perspective and our UN system partners perspective, including the UN resident coordinator system, and we have the RC from Barbados here looking at multiple offices in the Caribbean. We are going to accompany you in your journey towards the resilience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kishore, for your very excellent remarks and setting the stage for our panel discussion, which is to come next. And that will be followed by an interactive discussion as well as a wrap-up segment. But for now, for the panel discussion, I would like to invite Ms. Christelle Pratt, Assistant Secretary General, Environment and Climate Action of the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, to moderate the panel discussion. I would also invite the panelists to come and take their seats so we can begin the panel. So with that, I hand it over to Christelle.
Can you hear me? If I could invite my fellow panelists to the front, please. Special Envoy for Climate Change, His Excellency Ali Rashif, Carlos Lee Moresi, and Simon Springett. Thank you very much, Tishka. And thank you for the really eloquent opening remarks heard by US Undersecretary General Fatima and Special Representative for the Secretary General for the DRR, Mr. Kishore. All thanks. So I'm extremely pleased to be here today and to thank UN OHRLLS and UN DRR for providing the Organisation of African, Caribbean and Pacific States, the OACPS, this invaluable opportunity to actively participate. Knowing that 39 of our 79 member countries are SIDS, and within OACPS's constituent agreement, there is a SIDS forum, a subsidiary and consultative organ. For all OACPS members, all vulnerable developing countries, and especially for its SIDS and LDCs, how we approach and address attaining and maintaining sustainability and resilience is paramount. Policy coherence is therefore of utmost importance. So with these few words, let me begin this panel discussion with a keynote address by His Excellency, the Special Envoy for Climate Change, Ali Sharif. Excellency, thank you for accepting to be with us today and share with us the efforts made by the Maldives to achieve coherence and synergies between climate change action, including climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction measures in planning and implementation at the national level. So for the Maldives, what have been and what remain the challenges, and how do you plan to overcome them? So, Excellency Sharif, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, and actually, all. First of all, thank you for giving me this opportunity. And actually, first of all, I would say, the Minister of Environment was supposed to be here, but he was a bit engaged with, so I had to fill in for him. So he sends his kind regrets. But anyway, since I'm here, yes, so just to go directly on to your question here about how and how the Maldives is addressing the disaster risks, especially with the climate change adaptation. First of all, you see, one of the very key things which we have to realize is about the DRR and climate change adaptation. We have been, worked in very silo mode before, because that could be understood. Responding to the disasters is a very mandated specific task of a different organization, usually handled by the Disaster Management Authority. But while the climate change adaptation is mostly handled by the Ministry of Environment. But I think, there has to be a very strong synergy between these two, because if the adaptation efforts are not carried in the right manner, then the amount of damage and the impact that it could have later on to responding to those disasters would be much more. So now we are working much more closely with the Disaster Management Authority, the Met Office, and the Ministry of Environment as well, so that we could have the maximum benefit out of all these efforts that we are undertaking. So likewise, and it's good that Maldives got the disaster risk planning that's been completed, and we'd be working to implement that. And in addition, we are also trying to make the best effort out of predicting the future risks. For example, now we are trying to implement the impact-based forecasting, which will, let us tell, okay, where are the most vulnerable areas of the country are, what are the most significant hazards, and what would be the kind of impacts that it could have in. And that's where I think, where very key, where the disaster management authorities are coming in, because they are the people who would be responding on the ground at the disaster situations, and they collect the data, which is actually required to fine-tune these impact indices, which would be used by the Met offices to make the forecasts and warnings, so that it would become more beneficial for the responders when it comes to responding to the disasters. And in addition, also we are working on our national adaptation plan as well. The work has already begun, and of course disaster would be a very key element in that, because like I said, the adaptation can't be actually standing entirely in silo when it comes to addressing the disasters. Then also it was recently the president has announced that we'd be working on a more longer term 20-year plan as well, and which is where I think he has specifically mentioned that the climate resiliency and disasters would be at the very core of this national planning process in the next 20-year planning. Because we have seen and we are experiencing much more severe and more frequent actually disasters coming in. So that has to be a very core part of the national longer term planning. So that also would be one of the areas where would be integrating the disaster risk in the planning. And of course, like I said, this whole thing boils down to finance, and which is why Maldives being one of the co-chairs of the SIDS, and we had a very heavy hand in coming up with the Abbas, and which is why we focused. You could see that in Abbas a strong focus is given to the financing, specifically on the adaptation or even mitigation. Specifically more about reviving the international financing scheme so that it could be addressing towards the real needs of the SIDS. So we'd be also taking out the elements coming out from the Abbas into our national adaptation planning, so that we would be also implementing the Abbas. So that's one of the areas here, where we could be catching up with the finance, which is really needed, and we'll be trying how we could get the private sector to be part of these resilience strategies. Even now, through other initiatives, we have started to see how the private sector could be brought in, even through risk insurance modes or through other design perspectives, so that it would be much more beneficial, and so that we could reduce the impacts that we'd be feeling. So that's what, in a nutshell, what we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Special Envoy Sharif. And clearly, I think the Maldives are being extremely proactive and demonstrating considerable progress in terms of looking at policy coherence and then moving that from policy coherence to practice. Thank you very much. If I may now just move to our two distinguished panellists who are joining the Special Envoy today. Two panellists who are from three of the SIDS regions, and to give their insights on the issue of strengthening policy coherence in SIDS. And so we have with us today, as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Carlos Muresi. And Carlos, I just need to get your title absolutely correct. Mr. Muresi is the Program Advisor, Team Leader of Climate Finance and Resilience with the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. And so we're pleased to have you here today. And then we also have with us Mr. Simon Springett, the UN Resident Coordinator for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. But if I may just start with a question to you, Carlos. The Blue Pacific continent has been a pioneer, and I think we heard this from SRSG Kishore, a pioneer in developing and implementing integrated plans for climate action and disaster risk reduction. So what have been your experiences in advancing particularly interinstitutional and cross-sectoral coordination, including through using a comprehensive risk management approach? And another part to that question, how can this be strengthened? Because we can always continually improve. And what are lessons there, within the Pacific experience for some of the other, or for the two other SIDS regions? So a few questions wrapped up in one. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you. And I just want to thank UN DESA for the opportunity and giving us the opportunity to really share our experience. And I think it's not so much about what we are telling, but about the impacts that we can make. So for the Pacific, we have what we've developed more than 10 years ago now, the Framework for Resilient Development, commonly known as the FIRE. But that in itself is just, the really key comes into its implementation. So we've established, our leaders endorsed our Framework for Resilience Development, and then we established what we call the Pacific Resilience Partnership. And this is really the implementing mechanism through which the framework has been implemented. And the setup is quite simple if you think about it. It's about including, it's an inclusive approach where we have technical working groups on specific subsectors. So for example, I lead the disaster risk financing technical working group. We have one on water security. We have one on risk infrastructure. And invites a combination of people that participate, includes government agencies, includes NGOs, includes youth, includes women groups, includes partners. There's a lot of our UN partners, UNDP, UN DESA are part of these resilience partnerships. They all report up through a resilience task force that then reports to the leaders. So right at the outset, we have the leaders' endorsement, and we also have the reporting mechanism back up to the leaders. And I think that's an important way of framing how we actually attempt to do integrated risk management, or CRM. Just more recently, 2023, our leaders endorsed what we call the 250 strategy for the Blue Continent, where the FRDP is further brought into that element, elevating a little bit higher, so it becomes a regional framework and a regional strategy that actually looks and targets a specific thematic area on climate and disaster resilience. That also feeds down the other, trying to complete the circle, into the national development plans, which then further later comes out on a subset to the sectoral plans. Now, the important part is actually, when you talk about the sectoral plans being integrated, if you go back up the chain to the national development plans and into the regional framework, you're actually starting to do integrated management. You're starting to do programmatic approach. And I'll come back to that programmatic approach in the context of financing. But the programmatic approach then allows you to be able to, when you're doing, say, let's say you're doing water security. Water security also impacts your agricultural sector, which impacts your food security sector, impacts your health sector. So through that integration, through the PRP mechanism, you're able to have a lens on all the different sectorial and bring them together in terms of the implementation, that there are certain elements within the health that are related to water, that are related to agriculture, and so forth. Tying that back into, and we can't be proud of what we've been doing and sit back and relax, but we also have to move with the times and bring in technology. And I want to just touch a little bit on AI, and the special representative spoke a little bit about the risk-informed data that's required so that you actually understand your risk. So AI is coming to the fold, and we're using AI. AI has the ability to map data across different sectors. And it can project data forward or the impacts going forward, but you can also use AI to map backwards in terms of what pre-existed before. So, and this is the context of loss and damage. One of the issues with loss and damage currently is that you can't really measure it, given that we're so far under track and really have a good handle on what existed previously. So AI is allowing us this forward-looking and also backward-looking elements of risk and impacts. Now I want to wrap up in terms of the financing. And we talk about reform of the international financial architecture, But that's really about the excess. What I really want to focus on is on the climate finance effectiveness. In other words, what are you actually investing the financing in? Are you able to put the finance into effective outcomes and effective risk management and risk resilience building? And I've been promoting this way of looking at climate finance, especially in the adaptation sense. The climate finance is the premium, it's a risk premium on development. Now, the risk premium in an investment context is the additional return for the additional risk. That's your asset part of the ledger. If you look at it from the disaster risk element, if you factor in climate finance as a risk premium on development, as in the liability, you're actually trying to reduce your forward liabilities. To do that effectively, you need that data. You need that risk data to inform your development. And that's really a development-first approach. And I'll quickly, to end with an example, if you do, say, a climate change health project, you should not do it for health impacts. For climate impacts. You should do it primarily for health impacts. Right? That should be your primary, and the same thing applies to energy. When you're doing renewable energy, people talk about, okay, transitioning, but it should really be about meeting your power needs. It should be driven by your development needs. Now, obviously, power is and energy is a major input factor into economic development. And if you look at the ABAS, one of the very first pillars is economic resilience. So that is the development-first approach. Because if you do the development-first approach and you understand risk and overlay the risk and the additional cost, then you're actually able, over time, build resilience into your development. I'll stop there for now, and I'm sure by bringing that definition in, there's a lot of questions going to come. And I'm looking forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And if I may now just turn my attention to you, Mr. Simon Springett, resident coordinator, as I introduced you earlier to Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean states. How can the United Nations resident coordinator system better support coherent policy implementation in the SIDS regions? What have been some of the lessons learned, and perhaps best sharing those from the Eastern Caribbean region, a region you currently have remit for? Thank you.
Thank you, Christelle, and thanks for the opportunity to join this panel. I mean, in many ways, the resident coordinator system has been designed as a key instrument to ensure policy coherence, and this is both within and outside of the United Nations system. Clearly, coherent policy implementation, both nationally and regionally, is strengthened across the SIDS as resident coordinators cover multi-country offices. So we are able to have an understanding at a regional level of some of the issues at hand and how the United Nations system writ large is able to support those. I think this is quite important given the pressing priority to achieve coherence between both climate action, disaster risk reductions, as well as social and economic development, including through harnessing some of these emergency mechanisms for technical assistance and for financing. Caribbean states, like many SIDS, do not have sustainable financial and technical resources for adaptation policies, many times lacking sufficient human capacity in climate-related government departments, which also causes some problems for coherence and leads to some poor policy coordination, not only between governmental departments, but also between states, which oftentimes negatively affects the absorptive capacity when financing is available, and as well as also creates problems for DRR considerations, which are oftentimes missed in policy dialogues. We also have a number of partnerships with regional institutions, in my case, CARICOM, SEDIMA, and the OECS, but in the Pacific, there's other examples. And these partnerships with these regional institutions really position the United Nations system through the resident coordinator to work on these policy and coherence measures. I mean, as an example, in the Eastern Caribbean, to response to recent national disasters, we've seen effective cross-sectoral disaster response frameworks where climate, economic recovery, and health initiatives are coordinated, really underscoring the importance of integrating these policy areas rather than addressing them in silos. Many times this is done from our side through joint UN programs where multiple agencies come together. This way, the integration of policies can cover significantly more ground in a shorter space of time if coordinated effectively. Finally, just to say the RC system, as one additional example, really looks forward to working with UN DRR, who are working on an emerging Abbas DRR action plan with policy coherence really as a key tenet of this plan. So there's lots of examples where the RC system can really add value to policy coherence, both across the UN system but beyond. So we really very much look forward to working with our government counterparts to ensure that there's coherence not only across government programs, but also engagement across the greater United Nations system and with our partners. So we do always look forward to government counterparts reaching out through the RCO, our Resident Coordinator's Office, and we look forward to supporting in any way that we can. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to our three panellists. We do have a little bit of time for perhaps one or two questions, and so I look to the floor for a question or two. I know often these side events are so jam-packed that people that are listening may have some burning questions. Can I yield floor to anybody that would like to ask a question of the panellists or of our special representative SG for DRR? Here is your moment. Please raise your hand. So they've answered everything. Well, I would like to maybe just give an opportunity to the three panellists, having heard each other, whether you'd like to just make, sort of very short, brief comments on the various statements that we've just heard, or responses to the questions I put to you, and then I'll try to conclude with a few wrap-up points in terms of way forward that I've heard. So I'll yield to all three of you to just maybe provide a 30-second soundbite on what appealed to you, what stood out for you in some of the responses to the questions that I put, noting that we've got a really nice example of nested governance. We heard from Special Envoy Sharif at the national level what they're doing in the Maldives, and then we moved to Carlos, who really talked about the work that's happening at the regional level in the Pacific. And then, of course, notwithstanding that Resident Coordinator Springett works in the Caribbean at the moment, hearing just really how the Resident Coordinator system works. So I'll yield to our panellists for 30 seconds to 1 minute sound bites. Thank you.
Yes, I would take that short. So, my fellow here, he touched on the point of specifically about the, the financing, the revising of the international financial architecture. I think that's very critical, especially when it comes to addressing the disaster and the adaptation as well, because, usually even when we talk about mobilizing the private sector financing, for them to invest in a very risky places and on risky situations, usually, they tend to think twice or thrice. But I think, through this revision of the financial architecture, if the multilateral banks and, other agencies could come together to find a way to, de-risk these investments, then that will actually get the private sector buy-in to be more leaning towards, making their investments to be climate resilient, plus to invest in this kind of infrastructure or other efforts as well. So, like I said, there's a very high need of, trying to revise and relook at what the financial architecture is and how to get the private sector financing to be unlocked through these schemes.
Thank you very much, Special Envoy. So we'll move to Simon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe reflecting on the Pacific Forum, in the Caribbean we also have a large number of regional institutions. I named a few: CARICOM, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, and others. I have dedicated staff within my office to support some coordination with regional institutions, but I think we do still face challenges with inter-regional institutional coordination, trying to ensure that the policy coherence, the drive is carried as a collective across the regional institutions. We do look forward to working on that across our development partnerships, and the stronger the regional institutions are, I believe the better the impact we'll have across the regions.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank my fellow panelists as well for, while I'm also listening and learning some stuff that I think I can take back to the region, try to enhance what we're doing. Just to finish off, two really key points. I'll start off where I finished off around the data and AI, but the data is only as good as what you apply it to. So when you're talking about comprehensive risk management, most of the time we're talking about climate and disaster risk. But you should also factor in economic risk, financial risk. All those risks have an impact. While you're trying to address one risk, there are other risks. So when you're talking about comprehensive risk management, it has to be the entirety of the risk spectrum. And that takes a bit of time. So the second point I want to make is this: we have to be in it for the long term. It is a long-term investment before you see the returns. So the returns, obviously, you've seen papers. We've dealt with one of the papers a few years back around the triple dividends of integrated risk investment. And the triple dividends are really the early recoveries of economies, the lower cost of rebuild, and obviously the long-term sustainability of your development plans. So I just want to make sure that we are aware that this sounds very good doing a CRM and this integrated, but we have to be in it for the long term. People have to realize the FRDP, the Framework for Resilience Development, initially was developed for 5 years. When I first came to the forum, we made a stringent effort to extend it. Now we managed to extend it to 2030 to be in line with the SDGs. So then on the point of coordination, we need to ensure that all these different frameworks are aligned. Otherwise, our efforts go separate ways. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all panelists for those additional comments. And if I may, Simon just mentioned, I'm from the Pacific originally, and in the Pacific for quite some decades now, there is a plethora of regional organisations, but there is the Council of Regional Organisations of the Pacific. And is it working? It is. Oh, okay. Council of Regional Organisations of the Pacific, and the Pacific Islands Forum coordinates that. I understand that that's even matured further, where the UN resident coordinator works very closely with the Pacific Islands Forum Secretary General. So these are some models. Can be, as Carlos said, this cooperation, intra-regional cooperation between. But if I may, I think we're sort of reaching a little bit of time where we might want to make some conclusions. And what I did hear from all of the speakers, one of the things that I picked up, in fact, in the comments by the Undersecretary General Fatima, was she did mention that of the 3 SIDS regions, the Atlantic, Indian Ocean and South China Sea SIDS are perhaps not as organised as the Pacific and the Caribbean. And in that regard, I wonder how we can, again, through nested governance, try to provide support to our African, Indian Ocean and South China Sea SIDS. I do have a small recommendation or suggestion, and that is the OACPS. In fact, 39 of our members are SIDS, including the Maldives, who joined about 2 years ago. And we may want to think about using the OACPS SIDS Forum in terms of nested governance to see how we bring the 3 SIDS regions together to work on this issue of policy coherence, and beyond policy coherence, actually coherent practice, because that is where the rubber hits the road. But let me just perhaps turn to some of the key things that I pulled out of the excellent keynote addresses, as well as the responses to the questions. Integrating disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation perspectives, approaches and considerations should really be underpinning imperatives to achieving sustainable development and building resilience. And this is really not negotiable, and we've heard this, that we mustn't continue to silo things. We must look at aligning things. I think, Carlos, your comment about making sure that the duration of these plans actually converge, and if we do that, we can be far more effective and impactful. And beyond that, I think we've heard today that we need to align efforts between all frameworks, and we've heard this from the highest of levels, our Under-Secretary General, Special Representative, Resident Coordinator, that we've got to bring the ABAS, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the SDGs and other key policy instruments. So here today, the Paris Agreement and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And so we need to think about how we implement these in a very integrated, inextricably linked fashion, rather than seeing these as standalone instruments. Another that I heard was that action, including risk-informed investments, is needed to support SIDS to address adaptation and loss and damage, build capacity and enhance resilience. And throughout the discussion we did hear, and I think Special Envoy Sharif really emphasised this point, that no matter that we can have the strongest policies in place, you do need the means of implementation. And so the overhaul of the global financial system and our international financing institutions is something that we mustn't lose sight of, and we must focus on if we're going to succeed. I had already mentioned, but I think it's worth restating here, that the Atlantic, Indian Ocean and South China Sea SIDS do need some particular support, given that they do not have an established, robust regional coordination mechanism. And so to establish that, there really are some lessons to be learned, both from the Caribbean and the Pacific regions. And I think that in many respects, AOSIS, the OACPS SIDS Forum, the regional organisations such as the Pacific Islands Forum, CARICOM, the OECS, and the African Union, Indian Ocean Commission should come together to see how we might be able to make that possible and to pursue a really strong SIDS grouping. And finally, that, and we heard this through all of the presentations and the keynotes, partnerships with a range of stakeholders at all levels are needed to generate the necessary resources for coordination and implementation. And so we are ahead of time, so you can grab a coffee between side events. But I'd really like to thank you all for attending, but also to thank our keynote address, of course, USG Fatima not with us today, but SRSG Kishore, thank you very much, and thank you for staying throughout the event. And to our panellists, Special Envoy Sharif, Carlos Moresi, and Resident Coordinator Simon Springett. And to thank UNOHRLLS and UNDRR for really preparing this side event and for convening us here today, because it does shine a spotlight on the fact that we need to consider risk as an imperative in everything that we do, whether it be the ABAS or a national development plan, or even a community plan. Risk considerations and risk management considerations in all of our decisions are an absolute imperative. And I'd like to end there and wish you all an excellent day. Thank you.